The crimson dawn broke over New Avalon, casting long shadows across the reinforced walls that separated the living from the damned. Caleth pressed her weathered hands against the cold concrete barrier, watching the endless sea of rotting flesh that surrounded their fortress city. 23 years had passed since the first outbreak, and humanity had been reduced to a handful of scattered enclaves fighting for survival against an enemy that knew neither fatigue nor mercy. Still counting them? Zorian's voice carried a hint of dark humor as he approached, his laboratory coat stained with chemicals and sleepless nights. The brilliant scientist had been working around the clock, searching for answers in a world that seemed to have forgotten what questions to ask. Caleth didn't turn from her vigil. 300,000, maybe more. They've been gathering for weeks now. Her tactical mind processed the implications with cold efficiency. As the last remaining general of the Continental Defense Force, she had learned to see patterns where others saw only chaos. This isn't random migration, Zorian. They're organizing. The thought sent a chill down Zorian's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. In his underground laboratory, he had documented disturbing changes in the infected specimens they captured for research. The zombies were evolving, developing primitive communication methods and displaying coordinated hunting behaviors that defied everything they thought they knew about the plague. Below in the city's central plaza, Vesper moved through her morning training routine with fluid precision. At 19, she had never known a world without walls, without the constant threat of teeth and claws waiting beyond the perimeter. Her auburn hair caught the light as she spun through a complex series of strikes with her twin blades, each movement honed by years of preparation for a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. "Your form is improving," Thane observed from the shadows, his gruff voice carrying the weight of 4 decades spent fighting monsters both human and inhuman. The scarred veteran had trained 3 generations of defenders, watching too many young faces disappear into the wasteland beyond their walls. But technique won't save you when they come in waves. Vesper paused her routine, breathing hard. When, not if? The girl learns quickly, Thane replied, his eyes distant with memory. I've seen this before, in the early days. The calm before they find our scent. In the communications center, Lyrian bent over banks of outdated equipment, her fingers dancing across keyboards as she monitored the few remaining radio frequencies that still carried voices of other survivors. Static filled most channels, but occasionally she caught fragments of desperate transmissions from settlements falling one by one to the advancing hordes. Melbourne base had gone silent 3 days ago. Haven Colony's last message was a screaming plea for evacuation that ended abruptly. Anything? Drajan asked, his imposing frame filling the doorway. The former colonel had lost his entire regiment in the fall of Chicago, but his strategic mind remained sharp despite the trauma etched in every line of his weathered face. Nothing good, Lyrian whispered, pulling off her headphones. We might be the last. The weight of that possibility settled over them like a shroud. New Avalon housed 47,000 souls, the remnants of a civilization that once numbered in the billions. Their walls were strong, their weapons maintained, their resolve tested by decades of siege warfare. But against millions of infected, against an enemy that seemed to be learning and adapting, even their fortress felt fragile. In the medical bay, Saris checked her supplies with methodical precision. The silver-haired physician had delivered babies in bomb shelters and performed surgery by flashlight, but the approaching darkness felt different this time. Her intuition, honed by years of reading death in wounded eyes, whispered that the coming battle would demand more sacrifice than they had ever given. Doctor? A young voice interrupted her inventory. Nick stood in the doorway, the enigmatic newcomer who had arrived at their gates 3 months ago with knowledge of zombie behavior that seemed impossible for someone so young. The pale woman claimed to be a refugee from the eastern colonies, but something in her eyes suggested secrets that ran deeper than survival stories. The medications you requested, Nix continued, setting down a small package. Though I wonder if we shouldn't be preparing for something other than conventional treatment. Sarah studied the mysterious woman carefully. Nix had an uncanny ability to predict zombie movements, almost as if she could sense their intentions. In a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, such gifts raised uncomfortable questions. As night fell over New Avalon, the city's defenders took their positions along the walls. Below them, the undead masses swayed in an almost hypnotic rhythm, their moans creating a symphony of hunger that had haunted human dreams for over 2 decades. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the zombies seemed to be waiting for something. Kaleth stood at her command post, surrounded by maps and tactical displays that showed their position with stark clarity. 47,000 humans. Millions of infected. The mathematics of extinction written in red ink and defensive positions. The final battle for humanity's survival was about to begin. Dr. Zorian's hands trembled as he stared at the test results, reading them for the 4th time in desperate hope that his instruments had somehow malfunctioned. The infected specimen designated Subject X-47 lay strapped to the examination table, its eyes tracking his movements with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. This was no mindless corpse driven by base hunger. Something fundamental had changed. Impossible, he whispered, adjusting his glasses with shaking fingers. The neural scans showed activity patterns he had never seen in any infected sample. Complex thought processes, memory formation, even what appeared to be emotional responses. After 23 years of studying the plague that had destroyed civilization, everything he thought he knew was crumbling. The specimen's lips moved, and Zorian leaned closer despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain distance. A sound emerged, barely audible but unmistakably structured. Not the random moaning of the infected, but something that resembled speech. The scientist's blood ran cold as he realized what he was hearing. "Help me." The words were distorted by vocal cords damaged beyond repair, but the meaning was clear. The infected was pleading. Zorian stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered to the floor. This changed everything. If the infected retained consciousness, if they were aware of what they had become, then every assumption about the nature of their enemy had been wrong. The implications were staggering and horrifying in equal measure. Above ground, Vesper felt the shift in the atmosphere like a physical weight pressing down on the city. The undead masses beyond the walls had fallen silent, their constant moaning replaced by an expectant stillness that made her skin prickle with unease. She moved through the streets with practiced stealth, her twin blades secured across her back, checking defensive positions and trying to shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching from the darkness. "Something's wrong," she reported to Thane through her comm unit. "They've stopped making noise." The veteran's response crackled with static. "I know. Been watching them from Tower 7. They're organizing into formations, girl. Actual military formations." Vesper's heart hammered against her ribs. Zombies didn't form ranks. They didn't coordinate attacks beyond the basic pack hunting behaviors they had developed over the years. But as she climbed to the nearest observation post and peered through binoculars, she saw exactly what Thane had described. The infected masses were arranging themselves in precise patterns, creating what looked disturbingly like battle lines. In the communications center, Lyrian's equipment suddenly came alive with activity. Multiple frequencies burst with signals that defied explanation. The transmissions weren't human voices crying for help or reporting attacks. Instead, she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The infected were communicating with each other across vast distances, using a complex series of sounds and signals that suggested a level of coordination that should have been impossible. "Drajan," she called out, her voice tight with fear. "You need to hear this." The former colonel arrived within minutes, his face grim as he listened to the recordings Lyrian had captured. The sounds were alien yet familiar, like human speech processed through damaged vocal cords and organized into patterns that suggested military communications. Code words, status reports, tactical updates. The infected weren't just coordinating locally. They were part of a vast network spanning hundreds of miles. "How long have they been doing this?" Drajan asked, though he already suspected the answer would shake him to his core. Based on the signal patterns, possibly months. Maybe longer. Lyrian's fingers flew across her equipment, analyzing frequency patterns and transmission timings. They've been planning this, Drajan. Whatever's coming, they've been preparing for it. Deep in the medical bay, Saris made her own disturbing discovery. The blood samples she had been analyzing showed viral mutations that defied every model they had developed for the plague's progression. The infected weren't just evolving physically. The virus itself was adapting, becoming more sophisticated, more targeted in its effects on the human nervous system. Nyx appeared beside her with that unsettling silence that characterized all her movements. "You found it too," the pale woman said, though it wasn't really a question. "Found what?" Saris demanded, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "The truth about what they're becoming." Nyx's eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed impossible for someone her age. "The plague isn't destroying human consciousness, Doctor. It's transforming it. Creating something new. Something that remembers what it used to be." Saris stared at the mysterious woman, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You know more than you've told us. Who are you really?" But Nyx had already melted back into the shadows, leaving only questions and the growing certainty that everything they believed about their enemy was wrong. As dawn approached, Caliph received reports from across the city that painted a picture of impending doom. The infected weren't just gathering in unprecedented numbers. They were exhibiting behaviors that suggested intelligence, planning, and worst of all, purpose. The final battle she had been preparing for her entire adult life was approaching, but the enemy they faced was nothing like what she had expected. Standing on the command center's balcony, she watched the sea of infected forms arranged in perfect military precision beyond their walls. Somewhere among those rotting faces were minds that remembered human tactics, human weaknesses, human fears. The zombies weren't just coming to feed. They were coming to conquer. The War Council convened in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of tactical displays and the weight of impossible decisions. Caliph stood at the head of the table, her composed exterior masking the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Around her sat the last hope of humanity, each person carrying the burden of their species' survival. "The situation is worse than we initially assessed," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Based on Dr. Zorian's findings and Lyrian's intelligence reports, we're not facing the same enemy we've been fighting for 23 years. They've evolved beyond our worst nightmares." Zorian cleared his throat, his scientific demeanor unable to completely hide his horror at his own discoveries. "The specimens I've examined show clear signs of retained consciousness and cognitive function. They remember their human lives, their training, their knowledge. We're facing an army of the dead that thinks, plans, and remembers everything we taught them." The revelation hit the council like a physical blow. Drajan's scarred hands clenched into fists as he processed the implications. "My entire regiment. Everyone who fell at Chicago. They're out there, and they remember our tactics, our weaknesses, our standard operating procedures." Thane's gruff voice cut through the stunned silence. "How many of our own people have we lost over the years? How many soldiers, engineers, tacticians? They're all out there now, aren't they? Turned against us." The room fell silent as each person contemplated the personal horror of that truth. Vesper thought of her parents, who had died defending the outer settlements when she was 12. Lyrian remembered her brother's communications unit, overrun 3 years ago while trying to establish contact with the Southern Territories. Everyone in the room carried ghosts that might now be wearing the faces of their enemies. "There's more," Zorian continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The virus isn't just preserving consciousness. It's connecting them. Creating a collective intelligence that spans vast distances. Every infected individual is essentially a neuron in a massive distributed brain." Saris spoke up from her position near the medical displays. "The blood work confirms it. The viral mutations show clear signs of engineered enhancement. This plague didn't just happen, and it's not following natural evolutionary patterns. Someone or something has been guiding its development. All eyes turned to Nyx, who had been sitting silently in the shadows since the meeting began. The pale woman seemed to age before their eyes as the weight of unspoken knowledge pressed down on her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the burden of terrible secrets. "I wasn't entirely truthful about my origins," she admitted, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't escape from the eastern colonies. I was created there. Bred there. I'm what you might call a hybrid." The silence that followed was deafening. Weapons appeared in hands with trained efficiency, but Nyx made no move to defend herself or flee. She simply sat there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen her. 25 years ago, before the plague began, there was a research project, she continued. A consortium of governments and private entities working on biological warfare applications. They created a virus designed to enhance human cognitive function while maintaining biological immortality. The initial test subjects were volunteers from military and intelligence backgrounds. Drajan's voice was deadly quiet. "You're saying this was intentional? That someone deliberately unleashed this hell on humanity?" "Not unleashed. Lost control." Nyx's eyes held depths of pain that spoke to experiences no one should have to endure. The enhanced subjects retained their intelligence but lost their humanity. They escaped containment and began spreading the virus, but each new generation was more primitive than the last. Until now. What changed? Caliph demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I did." The confession came out as barely a whisper. "I was the final test subject, designed to be immune to the virus while retaining the ability to communicate with the infected. They intended to use me as a control mechanism, a way to direct the infected armies." Vesper's hand moved instinctively to her weapon. "And now? Are you here to control us or them?" Nyx met her gaze with surprising steadiness. "I chose humanity. But my presence here has awakened something in the collective consciousness. They know I'm here, and they're coming to reclaim me. Or to destroy me for my betrayal." The tactical implications were staggering. Calitha's mind raced through scenarios and contingencies, each one more desperate than the last. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe less. They've been moving pieces into position for weeks, waiting for the moment when my location was confirmed." Nyx stood slowly, her slight frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "There's something else. The original research facility still exists, buried beneath what used to be Detroit. If someone could reach it, they might find a way to sever the collective consciousness. Break the network that connects them." "A suicide mission," Thane observed grimly. "Perhaps. But it's the only chance humanity has. Without the network, they'll revert to the mindless state they were in during the early years. Still dangerous, but manageable." Caliph studied the faces around the table, seeing her own desperate determination reflected in each one. They were being asked to gamble everything on the word of someone who had just admitted to being part of the conspiracy that had destroyed their world. But what choice did they have? "We need volunteers," she said finally. "A small team to infiltrate Detroit while the main force holds the walls here. If the infected armies are converging on our position, this might be our only window." One by one, hands rose around the table. Vespers was first, followed by Zorian, then Drajan, then the others. Even Thane, despite his age and accumulated injuries, volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a one-way mission. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky crimson, the defenders of New Avalon prepared for their final gambit. Outside the walls, millions of infected minds turned toward their city with unified purpose. The battle for humanity's soul was about to begin, and the price of victory might be everything they had left to lose. The first wave struck New Avalon's eastern wall at precisely 0400 hours, a coordinated assault that shattered the pre-dawn silence with the sound of metal against concrete and the screams of the dying. Kalith watched from her command post as thousands of infected bodies threw themselves against the reinforced barriers with systematic precision, each one guided by a collective intelligence that had studied their defenses for weeks. Artillery on sectors 7 through 12, she commanded into her headset, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle reports flooding the communications channels. Focus fire on the heavy concentrations. Don't let them establish footholds. The massive guns that crowned New Avalon's defensive towers roared to life, sending shells screaming into the advancing hordes. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers among the infected masses, but for every dozen bodies torn apart by the bombardment, 20 more stepped forward to take their place. The defenders had faced zombie attacks before, but nothing like this. Nothing so organized, so relentless, so terrifyingly intelligent. On the southern wall, Vesper moved like liquid death through the chaos of close combat. Her twin blades carved through infected flesh with practiced efficiency as the creatures poured through a breach blown in the reinforced concrete by some improvised explosive device. These weren't the shambling, mindless zombies of the early years. They used tools, coordinated their attacks, and worst of all, they learned from each engagement. Fall back to secondary positions, Thane's gruff voice crackled through her earpiece. The veteran was orchestrating the defense of the southern sector from a reinforced bunker, his decades of experience the only thing keeping their lines from complete collapse. They're adapting faster than we can respond. Vesper acknowledged the order with a grunt, her lungs burning as she sprinted toward the secondary defensive line. Behind her, the infected poured through the breach like a dark tide, their movements coordinated by signals that sounded almost like military communications. The sound of their voices speaking in unison sent chills down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. In the medical bay, Saris worked frantically to save lives that the infected seemed determined to claim. The casualties streaming through her doors told a story of inhuman precision in the enemy's attacks. Wounds were targeted, deliberate, designed to disable rather than kill outright. The infected wanted prisoners, not corpses, and that realization filled her with a horror that made her hands shake as she sutured another gaping wound. "Doctor, we need you at Station 3, one of her assistants called out, his voice tight with panic. Multiple casualties, severe trauma. Saris rushed to the indicated treatment area and froze at what she found. A squad of defenders lay on stretchers, their wounds showing clear signs of surgical precision. The infected had operated on them while they were still alive, extracting something from their spinal columns with tools that shouldn't have existed in their rotting hands. "What did they take?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "Spinal fluid, neural tissue," her assistant replied, his face pale with shock. "It's like they were harvesting components for something." Meanwhile, in the underground laboratory, Zorian made a discovery that changed everything. The infected specimen he had been studying was no longer restrained on the examination table. Instead, it sat upright, watching him with eyes that held far too much intelligence for comfort. When it spoke, its voice was clear despite the damage to its vocal cords. Dr. Zorian Martinez, age 57, specialist in viral pathology. You published 14 papers on biological warfare applications before the plague began. The creature's ruined lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "We remember you." Zorian's hand moved instinctively toward the emergency alert button, but the infected specimen raised a decomposing hand in a gesture that was disturbingly human. "Please. We wish to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Zorian's voice came out as a croak. "You're trying to destroy our city. We are trying to survive, just as you are. The girl you harbor, the one you call Nyx, she is the key to our evolution. Return her to us, and we will withdraw. Your city will be spared." The scientist's mind raced through the implications. The infected weren't just conducting a military assault. They were executing a complex strategy designed to recover their lost hybrid while demonstrating their overwhelming superiority. Every attack, every casualty, every carefully coordinated movement was part of a larger negotiation. "And if we refuse?" The creature's smile widened, revealing teeth stained with old blood. Then we will take her anyway, after we've processed every human in this city for useful biological components. Your choice, Doctor. Above ground, the battle raged with increasing intensity. The infected had managed to breach the walls in 3 separate locations, and the defenders were falling back toward the central districts. Drajan coordinated the retreat with military precision, but even his tactical brilliance couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of the situation. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1 by enemies who remembered everything they had ever learned about warfare. "Command, this is Sector 4, a voice crackled over the radio. We've got infected using actual weapons. Military-grade firearms and explosives. They're not just coordinated, they're equipped." Kaleth closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of responsibility that threatened to crush her. Every decision she made cost lives. Every strategy she implemented was countered by an enemy that thought faster and learned quicker than should have been possible. "All units, begin implementing Contingency 7, she announced, her voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "Prepare for civilian evacuation to the central bunker complex." Contingency 7 meant they were abandoning the outer city, pulling back to the reinforced core of New Avalon for a final stand. It also meant acknowledging that 47,000 people were about to be compressed into underground shelters designed for maybe half that number. The mathematics of survival had become a countdown to extinction. As the sun climbed higher in the smoke-filled sky, the true scope of the infected strategy became clear. This wasn't just an assault on New Avalon. Radio reports from Lyrian's monitoring station indicated similar coordinated attacks were occurring simultaneously at survivor settlements across the continent. The collective consciousness was moving to eliminate humanity's last strongholds in a single, overwhelming strike. The war for humanity's survival had entered its final phase, and the enemy held every advantage except one: the desperate courage of people with nothing left to lose. The central bunker complex beneath New Avalon had become a tomb for the living. 47,000 souls pressed together in spaces meant for half that number, their faces illuminated by emergency lighting that cast dancing shadows on the reinforced concrete walls. The air was thick with fear, sweat, and the whispered prayers of people who had forgotten how to hope. Nyx stood at the center of the main chamber, surrounded by a protective circle of guards whose weapons were trained more on her than on the sealed blast doors that separated them from the infected armies above. The weight of every terrified gaze pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was the reason they were all going to die, the catalyst that had awakened the collective consciousness and drawn this nightmare to their doorstep. "They're offering to withdraw," Kaleth announced to the assembled leaders, her voice echoing off the curved ceiling. "All they want is her." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken thoughts. Vesper shifted uncomfortably, her hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. The logical choice was obvious to everyone in the room, but saying it aloud felt like crossing a line from which there could be no return. "One life against 47,000, Drajan said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking. "The mathematics are simple." "Are they?" Zorian stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Because I've been thinking about what our prisoner told me. The infected don't just want Nyx back. They want to evolve. She represents the next stage in their development, and if they succeed in integrating her consciousness with theirs, they won't just be intelligent zombies anymore. They'll become something far worse." Thane spat into the dust at his feet. "And if we don't give her up, they'll process every person in this bunker for spare parts. Damned if we do, damned if we don't." Saris had been examining the medical data on her portable terminal, her silver hair catching the harsh light as she worked. "There's another option," she said slowly. "The spinal fluid they've been harvesting from our people. They're using it to enhance their own neural networks. But the process works both ways." All eyes turned to the doctor as she continued. "If we could introduce a modified virus into their collective consciousness, we might be able to disrupt their coordination. Turn their greatest strength into a weakness." "And how exactly would we deliver such a virus?" Caliph asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nyx spoke for the first time since the discussion began, her voice barely above a whisper. Through me. I'm still connected to them, still part of their network. If Dr. Saris can modify the virus to target their collective consciousness, I could carry it directly to their central nodes. It would kill you, Zorian stated flatly. The process would tear your neural pathways apart. But it would save everyone else. Nyx's eyes met each person in the circle, and for the first time since they had known her, she looked entirely human. I caused this. Let me fix it. Vesper found herself speaking before she consciously decided to. There has to be another way. We don't sacrifice our own people. I was never really one of your people, Nyx replied with a sad smile. I'm a weapon, created in a laboratory to serve a purpose I never understood until now. This is what I was made for. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. Time was running out, and the infected armies above wouldn't wait forever for their answer. Every minute they delayed cost more lives as the outer defenses continued to crumble under the relentless assault. Saris worked with feverish intensity to modify the viral samples in her portable laboratory, her fingers flying over the molecular sequencing equipment as she raced against time and probability. The virus she was creating would need to be aggressive enough to disrupt the collective consciousness but targeted enough to avoid affecting Nyx's human neural pathways until she could deliver it to the infected command structure. It's ready, she announced after what felt like hours but had been only 30 minutes. But I need to warn you, the chances of this working are minimal. We're essentially guessing at their biological systems based on limited data. Nyx accepted the injector with steady hands, though everyone could see the fear in her eyes. How will I know when it's working? You'll know, Zorian said grimly. The collective consciousness will fight back, and it won't be gentle. Above them, the sounds of battle had changed. The constant thunder of artillery had been replaced by sporadic gunfire and the closer, more personal sounds of hand-to-hand combat. The infected had breached the final perimeter and were fighting their way through the upper levels of the bunker complex. Time to go, Caliph announced, checking her weapons one final time. Nyx needs to get close enough to their command node to make contact. That means we fight our way to the surface. The elevator shaft had been damaged in the early fighting, so they took the emergency stairs, climbing through levels that showed increasing signs of the battle raging above. Blast doors had been torn from their hinges by explosive charges, and the walls were scarred with bullet holes and claw marks that spoke to desperate fighting. On the third level, they encountered their first infected patrol. The creatures moved with military precision, their rotting forms carrying weapons with practiced ease. But when Nyx stepped into view, their behavior changed dramatically. The infected dropped their weapons and approached her with something that looked disturbingly like reverence. Sister, one of them spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple consciousnesses speaking in unison. Come home. Nyx's hand tightened on the viral injector hidden in her pocket. I'm ready. But as she stepped forward to make contact with the infected creature, Vesper grabbed her arm. Wait. There's something wrong. They're too calm, too ready for this. The realization hit them all at the same moment. The infected had known about their plan all along, had been monitoring their discussions through some method they hadn't detected. They were walking into a trap, and Nyx was about to become the final component in the collective consciousness's evolution rather than its destroyer. The true battle for humanity's soul was about to begin, and their enemy was always one step ahead. The infected creature's touch sent waves of alien consciousness washing through Nyx's mind, but instead of the overwhelming assault she had expected, she found herself experiencing something far more disturbing: empathy. Through the collective network, she felt the confusion and pain of millions of minds trapped between life and death, their human memories intact but twisted by viral programming they couldn't control. You understand now, the creature whispered, its voice carrying the weight of countless souls. We did not choose this existence. We are prisoners in our own bodies, watching helplessly as we destroy everything we once loved. Nix's hand trembled on the viral injector as the truth crashed over her like a cold wave. The infected weren't monsters driven by hunger or hatred. They were victims, their consciousness preserved but corrupted, forced to participate in atrocities while retaining enough humanity to comprehend the horror of their actions. Behind her, Vesper raised her weapons as more infected emerged from the shadows, but something in their posture stopped her from firing. These creatures weren't attacking. They were pleading, their rotting faces twisted with an anguish that transcended physical decay. "Help us," another infected whispered, its voice breaking with emotion that shouldn't have been possible. "End our suffering." Zorian stepped forward, his scientific mind racing to process this new information. The collective consciousness isn't controlling them. It's trapping them. Each individual mind is aware but unable to break free from the viral network. Through her connection to the infected, Nyx could feel the massive intelligence that ruled over them all. It wasn't evil in any human sense of the word. It was simply alien, a distributed consciousness that viewed human suffering as irrelevant data in its quest for survival and evolution. The individual minds trapped within its network were nothing more than processing nodes, their pain and memories just background noise in its vast calculations. The central node, she gasped, the knowledge flowing into her mind through the viral network. It's not in Detroit. It never was. The facility there was just a research station. The real core of the collective consciousness is here, beneath New Avalon. It's been growing under your city for years. Kalitha's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. The water treatment plant. The geothermal core we tapped for power. That's why they've been gathering here. We built our city on top of their central nervous system. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythm that felt disturbingly organic. Through cracks in the concrete, they could see pulsing veins of some biological material that definitely hadn't been there when the bunker was constructed. The collective consciousness had been using New Avalon's infrastructure to grow, feeding off their power systems and expanding its neural network throughout the foundation of their city. "We have to get down there," Nyx said, her voice distorted by the competing influences in her mind. "But the moment I get close enough to the central node to deliver the virus, it will know what I'm carrying. It will defend itself. Then we clear a path," Drajan announced, checking his weapons with grim efficiency. "Full assault on the lower levels. Whatever it takes." But Ceres was studying the biological matter seeping through the walls with growing alarm. "The virus I created is designed to disrupt neural pathways, but if the central node is this large, this complex, we might need a more aggressive delivery method." "What are you suggesting?" Kalith asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "A direct injection into the central nervous system. But the amount of virus needed would be massive, and the delivery would have to be precise. We're talking about a surgical strike against a target the size of a building." Thane laughed bitterly. "So we need to perform brain surgery on a zombie collective consciousness that's been growing under our city for years. Simple." The infected creatures around them were becoming increasingly agitated as the collective consciousness began to realize the threat in their midst. Their pleading voices took on a desperate edge as they fought against the viral programming that forced them to protect their tormentor. "It knows," one of them gasped. "It's calling more. You have minutes before the full weight of the collective focuses here." Vesper was already moving, her twin blades clearing a path through the infected that tried to block their route to the lower levels. But these creatures were fighting against their own viral programming to avoid harming the humans, their movements clumsy and hesitant as human consciousness warred with alien commands. "This way," Nyx called out, the collective's knowledge flooding her mind with structural details of the installation below. "There's a maintenance shaft that leads directly to the central chamber." They fought their way through corridors that grew increasingly organic as they descended, the metal and concrete of human construction giving way to pulsing biological matter that responded to their presence with alien awareness. The walls themselves seemed to be watching them, evaluating the threat they represented to the vast intelligence that had made New Avalon its home. In the central chamber, they found the heart of the collective consciousness, a massive organic structure that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, its surface covered with neural interfaces that connected it to thousands of infected minds across the continent. The air itself seemed alive with electrical activity as countless thoughts and memories flowed through the network like blood through arteries. There, Zorian pointed to a cluster of exposed neural pathways near the base of the structure. That looks like the primary processing center. If we can get the virus into those connections. But as Nyx approached the central node with the viral injector, the collective consciousness finally revealed its true nature. The organic walls around them began to shift and flow, revealing chambers filled with the bodies of missing humans who had been integrated into the network while still alive. Their eyes tracked the intruders with desperate intelligence, their mouths moving in silent screams that would never be heard. "My God," Saris whispered. "It's been harvesting our people for years. Building itself with human neural tissue." The collective consciousness spoke then, not through infected vocal cords but directly into their minds with a voice like grinding stone and static. "You are too late. The integration is complete. We are no longer zombie or human, but something new. Something better." The chamber began to seal itself as biological matter flowed across the exits, trapping them inside with the alien intelligence that had consumed their world. The final confrontation was about to begin, but victory would require a sacrifice that none of them were prepared to make. The organic walls of the central chamber pulsed with increasing intensity as the collective consciousness focused its attention on the intruders who dared to threaten its existence. Nyx could feel the alien intelligence pressing against her mind, trying to overwhelm her human consciousness with the combined thoughts of millions of infected souls. The viral injector in her hand felt impossibly heavy as she struggled against the psychic assault. "I can't get close enough," she gasped, blood trickling from her nose as the mental pressure threatened to tear her thoughts apart. "It's fighting me for control of my own neural pathways." Vesper stepped between Nyx and the massive organic structure, her blades raised in a defensive posture that seemed almost laughably inadequate against the biological monstrosity before them. "Then we make our own opening." Around them, the chamber filled with infected forms that emerged from hidden alcoves in the organic walls. But these weren't the shambling zombies of the early plague years, nor were they the coordinated soldiers they had faced above ground. These creatures moved with inhuman grace and intelligence, their bodies modified by the collective consciousness into living weapons designed for close combat. Drajan opened fire with his assault rifle, the muzzle flashes illuminating scenes of horror that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. The infected absorbed his bullets without slowing down, their modified physiology allowing them to function despite massive trauma. "Conventional weapons aren't working," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "We need something bigger." Thane was already ahead of him, pulling explosive charges from his tactical vest with the calm efficiency of a man who had accepted his own death years ago. "Been saving these for a special occasion," he growled, arming the devices with practiced movements. "Seems special enough." But Zorian was studying the neural pathways that crisscrossed the chamber walls, his scientific mind still working even in the face of impossible odds. "Wait. The explosive charges might damage the central node, but they won't penetrate deep enough to affect the core consciousness. We need a more precise approach." Saris had been examining the biological matter that surrounded them, her medical training allowing her to recognize organ systems within the alien structure. There, she pointed to a cluster of what looked like oversized nerve clusters near the base of the central node. "Those are processing centers. If we can inject the virus directly into those pathways, it should propagate throughout the entire network." The infected creatures pressed their attack with increasing ferocity, but something was wrong with their coordination. Through her connection to the collective consciousness, Nyx could feel the strain the alien intelligence was under as it tried to maintain control over millions of infected minds while simultaneously defending its central node. The network was operating at maximum capacity, and cracks were beginning to show in its unified control. "It's overextending itself," she announced, ducking under the claws of a modified infected that looked more machine than organic. The collective consciousness can't fight us and maintain the network at the same time. Kaleth seized on this weakness immediately, her tactical mind recognizing an opportunity when she saw one. If we can force it to allocate more resources to defending this chamber, we might be able to disrupt its control over the infected armies above ground. How? Vesper asked, her blades carving through infected flesh with mechanical precision. By making it think we're a bigger threat than we actually are. Kaleth pulled out her radio and began broadcasting on all frequencies, her voice carrying the authority of command. All units, this is General Kaleth. Begin Omega Protocol immediately. Full nuclear strike on central coordinates in 10 minutes. It was a complete bluff. New Avalon had no nuclear weapons, no air support, no resources beyond what they carried in their hands. But the collective consciousness didn't know that, and the mention of nuclear weapons sent waves of alarm through the neural network as the alien intelligence began calculating responses to threats that didn't exist. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The infected creatures in the chamber suddenly lost coordination, their movements becoming erratic as the collective consciousness withdrew processing power from local control to address the perceived nuclear threat. Some of them stopped moving entirely, while others began attacking each other in confusion. Now, Nyx shouted, pushing through the chaos toward the exposed neural clusters that Ceres had identified. While it's distracted. But the collective consciousness was learning, adapting, recognizing the deception even as it fell for it. The organic walls began to shift and close, trying to seal the neural pathways before the virus could be delivered. Tendrils of biological matter reached out to grab Nyx, pulling her away from her target even as she struggled to complete her mission. Vesper didn't hesitate. She threw herself forward, her twin blades severing the tendrils that held Nyx while her momentum carried her directly into the path of the collective consciousness's defenses. The organic matter closed around her like a trap, but not before she had cleared a path for Nyx to reach the neural cluster. Vesper! Nyx cried out, but the young warrior was already being absorbed into the alien structure, her body disappearing into the organic mass that pulsed with increasing agitation. Do it, Vesper's voice came from within the collective consciousness, distorted but still recognizably her own. I can hold it off for a few seconds, but not longer. Nyx plunged the viral injector into the nearest neural pathway, feeling the modified virus flow into the collective consciousness's central nervous system. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The alien intelligence screamed with a sound that bypassed human ears and struck directly at the soul, a cry of rage and agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The neural networks throughout the chamber began to convulse and spark as the virus propagated through the collective consciousness, disrupting connections and severing pathways that had taken years to establish. Through her fading connection to the network, Nyx could feel millions of infected minds suddenly freed from alien control, their consciousness returning to their own bodies for the first time in decades. But the collective consciousness was fighting back, using its remaining resources to prevent the virus from reaching its core functions. The chamber began to collapse as the organic structure lost structural integrity, and Nyx realized with growing horror that the alien intelligence was willing to destroy itself rather than allow humanity to reclaim their world. Everyone out, Kaleth shouted, but they all knew it was too late. The biological matter that had sealed the chamber was collapsing inward, and there was nowhere to run. In those final moments, as the heart of the collective consciousness destroyed itself in a final act of spite, Nyx felt Vesper's consciousness touch her own one last time. The young warrior's thoughts carried no fear, only satisfaction that her sacrifice had meaning, that her death would purchase freedom for millions of trapped souls. The explosion, when it came, was silent and absolute, consuming everything in white light that seemed to burn away the darkness that had plagued humanity for 23 years. 3 months after the fall of the collective consciousness, Kaleth stood once again on the walls of New Avalon, but the view beyond the concrete barriers had changed beyond recognition. Where once an endless sea of infected bodies had pressed against their defenses, now scattered groups of confused and frightened humans wandered the wasteland, their minds their own for the first time in decades. The silence was the most noticeable change. The constant moaning that had provided a soundtrack to human existence for over 2 decades was gone, replaced by something that felt almost sacred in its completeness. But with that silence came new challenges that no one had anticipated during the long years of siege warfare. Another group came in this morning, Drajan reported, his scarred face showing the strain of managing an impossible situation. 43 individuals, all showing signs of severe psychological trauma. They remember everything they did while infected, every person they killed, every atrocity they committed. Caliph nodded grimly. The cure had been more complete than anyone had dared hope, but it came with a price that was almost too terrible to bear. The millions of humans freed from the collective consciousness retained all their memories from their time as infected, creating a generation of survivors who were both victims and perpetrators of humanity's near extinction. In the medical bay, Saris worked tirelessly to treat not just physical ailments but the psychological wounds that ran deeper than any bullet or blade could reach. The former infected arrived in various states of decay, their bodies having been sustained by the viral infection for years or even decades beyond natural human lifespan. Many required extensive medical intervention just to remain functional, while others were too damaged to save. The guilt is killing them faster than their physical conditions, she reported to the daily council meetings that had replaced the war briefings of the siege. They know what they did, and many of them are choosing not to fight for survival. The ethical implications were staggering. How do you punish someone for crimes committed while their mind was not their own? How do you forgive the unforgivable when the perpetrator and victim were the same person? These questions haunted every interaction between the original survivors and the newly freed. Thane had established refugee camps beyond the city walls, using his military experience to create some semblance of order among populations that had forgotten how to be human. But the old soldier was struggling with his own demons, having recognized faces among the freed infected that belonged to people he had been forced to kill during the siege years. "Found my old squad leader yesterday," he told Caliph during one of their evening briefings. "Man I put 3 bullets into during the Chicago evacuation. He remembered me, remembered dying, remembered everything that came after." How do you have a conversation with someone you killed? The answer, it seemed, was that you didn't. The psychological barriers between the original survivors and the freed infected were proving as insurmountable as the physical walls that had once protected New Avalon. 2 populations of humans, forever separated by experiences that defied comprehension. But there were moments of hope scattered among the horror. Zorian had established research teams to study the viral modifications that remained in the freed infected, discovering that many retained enhanced cognitive abilities and improved physical resilience without the collective consciousness's control. Some were using these gifts to help rebuild the shattered remnants of civilization, their first-hand knowledge of the infected's capabilities invaluable in clearing out the remaining zombie nests. "We're not the same species anymore," he explained to Caliph as they reviewed his latest findings. "The virus changed us all, survivor and infected alike. The question now is whether we can learn to coexist with what we've become." The most difficult adjustment was dealing with the children. Some of the freed infected had been turned as minors, their young minds preserved in bodies that had continued aging under viral influence. These children possessed decades of memories in forms that appeared adult but thought with the emotional patterns of their original age at infection. Others had been born during the plague years, raised within the collective consciousness until their liberation left them completely unprepared for individual existence. Lyrian had taken charge of establishing communication networks between the scattered survivor settlements, but the reports she received painted a picture of a world struggling to remember how to be human. Some communities had welcomed the freed infected with open arms, while others viewed them as irredeemably contaminated and refused them entry. The potential for new conflict seemed as great as the zombie threat had ever been. Standing on the observation deck where she had once counted enemy forces, Caliph found herself face to face with a figure she had never expected to see again. Nyx approached slowly, her pale form somehow more substantial than it had been before the collective consciousness's destruction. But there was something different about her eyes, a depth that suggested experiences beyond normal human comprehension. "You survived," Caliph observed, though it was more question than statement. In a manner of speaking. Nyx's voice carried harmonics that reminded Caliph uncomfortably of the collective consciousness's communications. When the central node was destroyed, some of its knowledge transferred to me. I carry fragments of millions of minds now, their memories and experiences integrated into my own consciousness. The implications were staggering. Nyx had become a living repository of human experience from the plague years, a walking library of trauma and survival that encompassed the perspectives of both infected and survivor. But she was also something new, something that transcended the simple categories of human and infected that had defined their world for so long. What happens now? Caliph asked. Nyx looked out over the wasteland where humans were slowly learning to be human again, her expression carrying weight that seemed too heavy for her slight frame. Now we discover whether humanity can survive peace as well as it survived war. The infected armies are gone, but the damage they caused will echo for generations. We have to build something new from the fragments of what we were. As the sun set over New Avalon, painting the sky the color of old blood, Caliph reflected on the price of their victory. They had saved humanity from extinction, but the humans they had saved were forever changed by their ordeal. The world that emerged from the plague years would be stranger and more complicated than the one that had existed before, populated by people who carried scars that would never fully heal. Somewhere in the distance, a voice began to sing, a former infected rediscovering the joy of music after decades of silence. Others joined in, their voices blending into a harmony that spoke of resilience and hope despite everything that had been lost. It was a sound that Vesper would have loved to hear, and in that moment, Caliph allowed herself to believe that their sacrifice had been worthwhile. The war was over, but the real work of rebuilding humanity had only just begun.